Evening, Michael. How you doing?
Oh, good. Thanks, Shane. How about yourself?
Yeah, good. It's the business year of the business end, I should say, of the business year, and we've been really flat out, as I'm sure you have as well, and quite a lot of lawyers have been, with some certainly curly ones, so to speak, and
Mhm.
it's been exhausting and challenging, but also never stop learning in this profession, and that's one of the really cool things about it. So on that note, I had my our friend and colleague Brent Norling in our office the other day regarding a matter we're working on together, and um, we briefly discussed some of the stuff he's working on at the moment. He is the lawyer dealing with the Nido liquidation, and it's just sorry, I'm just getting a bit of feedback, and I think sometimes that's if you have a Facebook page open, according to people that know more about the stuff than me. I don't think I do, but let's just make sure. Sorry about that. We're
That's
not
all good.
we're not yet sort of TV1 or TV3 or Sky quality in terms of our broadcast, but we'll get there eventually, won't we, Mike?
That's the plan.
So Brent and I we just mentioned, talked about that Nido thing because it's really topical at the moment, and we won't, for professional reasons, won't go into anything that he's doing on this. But what I do find really interesting is the whole the questions that whole case, or that whole matter, I should say, raises in terms of mum and dad property investors and putting their money into projects like Nido. Now, Tim Hunter from the NBR wrote, and I know Tim reasonably well from some stuff that we've done together, but Tim's, in my opinion, an excellent journalist, and he did I sent it to you, Mike, a very good NBR article about this whole Nido situation, and he was relatively harsh or critical on the bona fides, so to speak, or the whole scheme of property syndicates, particularly where there is debt funding in front of it, and we'll get to what that means in a minute. But as always on the NBR, which is probably my favorite, other than interest.co.nz, my favorite business website in New Zealand, as always, the comments are always as good, if not better, than the article. And I really liked some of the comments in there saying, well, just hold your horses here, Tim, because while this obviously is a far less than ideal situation for the property syndicate versus the debt investors, these syndicates actually work very well in the most number of cases for persons who are not able to necessarily raise enough funds to put into property, particularly with the way prices have gone, particularly in Auckland, but also just in general. A lot of them do work well, and they don't make the headlines because it seems to make the headlines if it's a really bad situation. So I just find that whole, and so if you've got an NBR subscription out there, you definitely need to read Tim Hunter's article about, like I said, the virtues and the not so virtuous aspects of property syndicates. But I thought that the comment section, particularly that around of the fact that a lot of the reason, arguably, this failed is because Nido was inseparable financially, the business, from the development. It was the same guy that was trying to do it all. And it's an enormously ambitious startup, and that obviously COVID didn't help, but that the whole financial impact crept into, and in my view, kind of cross-pollinated the whole project to the point that you couldn't really say definitively what exactly caused this whole thing to be the palaver that it's become today. So what are your thoughts on the article?
Yeah, I agree with you. I thought it was a very good article. I agree with your
Very
observation.
good.
The comments on NBR are often just as interesting, and I kind of I found myself flip-flopping a little bit between the two positions. Like, it was interesting. The last time we did this, we talked about how there's not necessarily any immorality or any sort of ethical dimension to bankruptcy. And, so on the one hand, it is the case that no one promoting this sort of scheme wants to go bankrupt. And, the timing could not really have been worse to launch a big brand store in West Auckland than this year, right after COVID. So, though I gather that that's sort of mixed up in a number of reasons why this may have happened. And, this asset class seems to be becoming more common. And there are obviously reasons why it's attractive to people, because it is a way to get into the whole housing boom if you don't necessarily have the money to go in on your own. And a lot of them seem to work well for people. So, I mean, probably two things I'd add. One is I didn't really agree with making a moral contrast between the party that provided the financing and the consortium. To me, it's just such as life. When you've got a very sophisticated party to a multi-party bargain, they're going to strike a better deal than an unsophisticated party. And in fact, here you've got real moral hazard, because the people, who are negotiating this finance arrangement and representing the members of the consortium, the promoters, don't really have a direct interest in ensuring that the promoters are in a better position or an equal position to the lender, or that the respective parties' positions kind of correspond with the risks that they're taking. I think in terms of potentially criticising that sort of model of investment, I do think it's the case a lot of people think they understand property as an investment better than they do, particularly people who have had some experience dealing with residential realty. And that's in that sort of mum and dad investors class. There's a lot of people who have had one or several rental properties, and it's perceived as a very safe thing. It's a tangible, solid thing. And they may not necessarily understand the complexities and the risks involved in commercial realty. And that's particularly so when there's lending, and really particularly so when it's a development, as this was. So I think that's a sort of reasonably ersatz summary of what I got from it, Shane.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you. There was a lot of clarity in that. I really like your comment around the lack of distinction from a moral hazard point of view, as you put it, between the two financiers, or the two different bands of investors, and how it was sort of, I don't think he pinned I can't forget the name of the pearl fisher as the sort of sophisticated sharp end of town, knight in shining armor, so to speak, in terms of going in and getting a really good deal for their people. Well, they got it for themselves, but B, like you said, that is, since Adam played fullback, the world has been full of people who have knowledge on a subject and people that don't. And if you're unlucky enough to be really just quixotically thrown in with the people that unfortunately didn't get into the right group, it's really can be as without rhyme or reason as that. You really can just end up in that group of people that didn't have any fallback, or you could just as luckily end up, and I bet you some other people in each group at other times perhaps have been the other way around, and perhaps the people that have ended up potentially on the wrong side of this in the future will do it, but they'll learn and read and understand what all this means. At the end of the day, if you're investing in property, the whole appeal of property, like you said, Michael, and maybe people conflate that term or that asset class into something which is an assumption that they're getting bricks and mortar, when perhaps they're not always getting bricks and mortar. Hanover Finance is one that comes to mind there. And so to have the investment class as property, but have your bundle of particular rights not being just an interest in that land, particularly when it's sitting behind debt security, and particularly, I think even here, like I said at the beginning of this little session, the fact that it was for the cash to actually flow through this mechanism for it to stay afloat, an incredibly ambitious startup furniture retailer had to get going. It's quite a hurdle to overcome, even for a good business. And good businesses even can trip up. I've read, I'm sure you have quite a few entrepreneurial books, Branson's book and all that. Nearly all these guys have problems along the way before they actually find and learn from their mistakes. And to be in that honeypot, so to speak, of uncertainty and ambition, with the guys taking the startup risk, and it's your money on in a roundabout way. That's
on that point, Shane. I think the stat is something like 80% of businesses that start up, collapse within 5 years, and that kind of makes it clear what an extraordinarily risky investment this was, because the building was purpose built for this kind of business, and there's really no easy alternative use to put it to. And so you're banking it all on this business succeeding, and there was no way to get your money out. It was completely indeterminate when you actually got your investment back.
As always with these sorts of things, the closer you are to the coalface of the actual factual reality of what went on, like you and I know very little more really than the people listening to this little session we're doing. We don't really know anything. And I've read about stuff that my clients have been involved in the NBR and in the paper, and sometimes what's reported versus what's going on is a markedly different scenario. So I'm loath to actually guess what really happened there, or if you talk to someone really close to them, might be, it's obvious because of this, and if it hadn't been for that'd be fine. Or they might say, oh my God, that thing never could have worked because of certain fundamentals in this game. The point is, if you're going to this as an investor and you don't have that understanding in a really esoteric technical area, you really are out on the bloody the big surfboard with no wetsuit on and no idea what you're doing because you're heading for the rocks, because it's like, man, you've got to, if things do go wrong, you've got no way of getting your money back, but even understanding what you should be doing next to mitigate your situation. So I feel for those people. Just one thing I wanted to talk about though was, and this was building on some of the stuff that was in the comments, that I thought was a really realistic and gave it some symmetry, as you like to say, in terms of the whole position. People shouldn't see that and then just be dissuaded from getting into the syndication idea, because if those fundamentals are right, and if they know the people, know the project, and they spend 50 hours, 100 hours reading up about all this sort of thing, people are going to want to take some risks, and then particularly with 0% interest rates, and not all of us can put money into expensive Auckland property, and the share market is very distrusted by particularly the boomer generation in New Zealand after the events of '87. It's a viable option, and it's like, I don't think people should just throw the baby out with the bathwater because they read of one kind of horror case that in some ways really fell on the particularities of the situation that these unfortunate people find themselves in.
Yeah, and I don't think that they're all created equal. Like, as well as understanding the actual underlying, project that you're investing in, there's also, scrutinizing or having a professional advisor scrutinize. And often it seems people get introduced to these kind of things through their accountants. So probably getting a lawyer involved here to actually see what the terms of how this is legally structured and what the terms of the deal are, because it does seem that there's quite a level of diversity in how this has gone about, and the way in which you can recoup your investment and when and on what terms. And
I would love to know. I'd love to know as well, and perhaps it will come out to some extent, perhaps in the media, perhaps in a case, if there is a case. But I'd love to know some of the, I don't want to say scuttlebutt, but some of them. I'd love to see some of the maybe sweet nothings that were whispered in people's ears in terms of why those with a vested interest to paint them into a corner to actually do this, because a lot of people don't read. The best of our clients, as we know, don't often read really important documents. They just want you to explain it. And it's sort of anathema to them. It's stressful, and it's something that they're paying someone like us or their accountant to actually look into and say, do you really understand, John and Sandra, do you really understand that you're putting in 75,000? Do you understand that if anything goes wrong, the people who are investing in the debt funding of this project will get all their money back because they have a first ranking mortgage the same way BNZ does over your house in the middle of Epsom or Mount Eden. And so if things go wrong, as long as the residual value of that development gets to a point where they can pull the plug and get all their money back, whereas you're in a situation where you actually need all of the stages of this development to work so that you can actually get your money back. Now, if someone sat there and explained that to all of these people that put their money into the syndicate, would they have made a different decision? I don't know. And that's what someone, I think it was maybe Tim or someone in the comment section actually pointed out. A lot of the time, people would be given this information and would still make the same decision. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have that information, because it's they can feel far less hard done by if they didn't know the risks of that and then took them anyway. But B, just from a societal point of view, it's just not right. And that's why there are bodies like the FMA that if people are getting into the conflation of this is a property investment, it's not really a property investment. As you said, it's a bundle of rights that relies on certain events happening, controlled by human beings for you to recover your money. And it's quite a fundamental difference.
I think that's very true. Like, I think, it's very much the case that, we live in an age where we're bombarded daily with a lot of information. And so ordinarily, we become very good at just taking away the headlines. What's the main point here? What is the takeaway? And obviously in a thing like this, it's very much the details and the small print that matter. The headline of you can get 8% return. That's the one thing I did think was cute, actually, on the part of the promoters. I thought it was rather cute that they guaranteed 8% in the first year and met that guarantee by returning 8% of the funds to the investors. That raised an eyebrow about, like I don't know anything about the particulars of that, but it seemed like a surprising thing to be able to do. But then on that point of regulation too, it's the case that there's a balance that kind of has to be struck there as well. Obviously, the more you regulate all of these things, the more cost there is in doing that, and the less efficient the economy becomes. And you do need to ensure that people are provided the proper information and are able to make informed choices. But I think it's also the case, it's a little bit like how everyone says, privatize gains and socialize losses, how that's always a canard that comes out, when a big company goes bust. Well, when the mum and dad investors go bust, what always comes out is this, oh, shucks, these poor people are so ignorant. And for some people that might be true, but there's also got to be a class of people who, really did know, hey, this thing is more risky than other things I might do with my money. But gee, a 12% return or whatever it's going to be sounds really attractive when the bank's giving me one.
I don't necessarily think that it was a gimmick. It was maybe a bit of a gimmick, but I don't necessarily think it was designed to give a false sense of security, that the whole guarantee thing. I think it was just, I don't want to say noble, because it's not a word I'd use often in a sentence with developer, but I think it was in some ways noble that, or showing good faith. They were saying, well, there is a chance, a very good chance, that it won't have the revenue to generate in that period. So here's your return. But I agree, it is perhaps a little.
Perhaps a little bit that line of reasoning.
Yeah, you're right. Perhaps you're right. It is a little bit cute in the sense that that's the sort of that was the real carrot for these people to get this return coming through. that was what it was predicated on.
And and ask yourself, like, like if I said to you, give me 50K and, I'm going to invest it and make you some money. And if in the first year I don't manage to make you any money, well, I'll give you some of the money you've invested back and say, there's your return. I mean, I think most people would say, well, either, no, give me all of my money back, or no, keep all of it and invest it in the thing it was supposed to be invested in. Like, if I'm giving it to you to invest, it's for a reason, I thought that was sort of, I can't see, I mean, and maybe I might think of something after, an hour or two from now and feel silly, but it's hard to think off the top of my head of what a sort of commercially justifiable reason for that is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's easy to be critical, negative with hindsight. I mean, if the thing took off, then no, we wouldn't be talking about it now, would we?
Well,
I was thinking about it. So, in really simple terms, you got the two. So you got the debt and the equity investors, and essentially the difference is if you line them both up on a slot machine that sat next to each other, and you said to the equity guys, you're going to sit here and you're going to put money into the slot machine. We can't tell you when you're going to get your return back. But by the way, if you run out of money after $1,000, then you get nothing back. Then you put the investor next to them and go, oh, here's here's money for you, and you actually don't have a limit. So it doesn't matter if you ever run out of money. You may not get the wonderful returns you thought you were going to get, but at any point you can, if things don't go right, the money will never run out, and you just get your money back. It really is that simple when you think about it, because the guys that were relying on a certain sequence of macroeconomic things to happen with that, and microeconomic with that whole development, they literally. But for being able to get out the other side, and God knows how close they were or weren't, the whole thing is binary for them, or zero sum, to the extent that they now get potentially nothing. Whereas the people that had it structured the other way, there's no risk of tipping over. So in a weird kind of way, the investors end up with the same risk as the developer, don't they?
Well, that's right. I mean,
so they're really, and for their meager, they're really getting a marginally better than debt. No, in this case, they didn't even get. That's the irony. Better than debt. What do you call it? Interest rate of return. But they were really equity investors for the whole development.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the people, whose shoes I'd like to fill are the lenders. You look at their position, it's just gravy. Like,
yeah, but did you see though what quite a few of the comments people were saying about is it Jarden that own Bill Fisher, and about how, I don't know whether that's true or not, it's just scuttlebutt, but they're saying the banks wouldn't touch it because while fiscally they can, it is definitely advisable, but is it morally scurrilous to the point that it would attract the condemnation of the press and therefore be bad for the brand? I don't even know about that. I don't really see that. The banks aren't exactly held in high regard anyway.
I mean, they don't see themselves like that, though. You see those ANZ ads and Westpac ads and all the rest on the TV at night, and the kind of brand impression they want to provide to the country is, they're these lovely people that you go along to. They don't even act like they're a business in terms of how they promote their brand. They act like they're doing you a favor. And I can kind of see that you look at it like the amount of lending in contrast to the equity there, like there was never any realistic risk that they wouldn't be able to get the value of the lending back. In the meantime, they're going to be making like a 20% return. And if there was default, they're going to be making like a 40% return.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fantastic position to be in. So, I can't look at that and say, well, a bank's not going to touch that from a risk analysis perspective, other than if you try and justify it on this idea that the brand risk, the reputational risk is big. And I can, like you, I'm not sure how realistic that actually is, but I guess these big institutions are risk averse when it comes to their brand.
Yeah, particularly if they've got other, and they do, of course, simpler, easier, under the radar ways to just at scale make, although my friend Kane Wallstrom at Money Empire and the Beyond the Field podcast, he might beg to differ, and I know he's been working on something in terms of, to compete with the banks in terms of, it's quite an interesting project, and whether that kicks off or any other kind of mechanism which can, cut out the middleman in terms of mortgage brokers and be more efficient with the bank and the approval process. And I think the bank space, I don't really, to be honest, have a huge amount of knowledge about it. I think it's a massively interesting space right now, prone to disruption, but I think that it'll need to get enough. Because when big business like that has all of the inertia behind them and all the history behind them, it takes someone with similarly deep pockets, or at least in the same, conversation, so to speak, to have the economic and political will to disrupt. So I think that's why it hasn't been disrupted for so long. But surely at the moment, with things the way they are, surely this is a ripe time for some sort of disruption from someone with deep enough pockets to actually make enough noise to actually achieve something. Again, though, the question is particularly in the short to medium term, is that necessarily desirable? I don't know. It could be, you think it could be great, but maybe not. It could be that the gap between the haves and the have-nots widens even more. Who knows? It'll be bloody interesting, though. I remember my political science lecturer at Paul Buchanan at Auckland University saying one day in lecture, and he was an interesting guy, to say the least. He was certainly not just a lecturer, but he was saying that he goes, he's an American guy. He's like, I think that, from a political science point of view, easily the most exciting time to be alive would have been, during the Bolshevik Revolution. I remember turning to a girl I was friends with in the class and going, yeah, maybe from a political science point of view, but I don't know how much freaking fun it would be being in Russia.
Well, I mean, the word there is interesting, right? I think the Chinese have an expression, don't they? May you live in interesting times. I think that's meant to be a curse. The time you want to live in is prosaic and boring, and everything just ticks over as it has before. But they're not the times that we're living in, really, from the looks of things. There's a
White Island. We're going to talk a little bit about White Island. This is more yours is more your one than mine, so I'm going to take a bit of a back seat for this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought we could probably just bat it around a little bit. It kind of dovetails quite well with what we were just talking about, because, specifically when you said that, often when you're not, you see something in the media, and when you're not face to face with it, like, the impression that you're provided is not particularly accurate. You're not really seeing what people behind the scenes are seeing. And I just thought about, when I saw this thing come out that these people who have been characterized as heroes, that went back and staged the rescue, have been slammed with criminal charges by WorkSafe. Initially, I was kind of just as pissed off about that as I think most people are. And I was actually going to write about it. I was going to have another pitch at the NBR and go on the tirade about the health and safety legislation. But I checked myself once I started doing that, because I thought, it's very easy to assume the government's overreaching, because, that's where at least a lot of my biases lie in a sort of slightly anti-government direction. And and particularly when the media paints a heroic picture of the people that have been charged. But then I thought, people who have gone down that road, like the people that are signing petitions and all the rest, could really end up with egg on their faces over this. Like, you've got to ask yourself, people aren't morally black or white. Like, could a person who's heroic enough to jump in their helicopter, no thought of their own safety, go straight there and rescue someone, could that person also be the kind of person who didn't have particularly good systems in place in their business? Well, it seems quite possible to me that those two character traits could coexist. So I thought, until it really comes out, there's no way to know. There are a few things that would make one skeptical, like it's been reported that some of the charges are about regulatory breaches that aren't actually connected to anything to do with the tragedy, like asbestos or something. I think if that turns out to be true, that's incredibly reprehensible behaviour from WorkSafe, and there should be, a widespread reaction to that. But there are also, sort of with that big caveat aside, there are things about how our health and safety legislation is structured that, means there's reason to be somewhat sceptical of WorkSafe here. And I think the big thing is, the standard in this space, it's not the negligence standard. You don't have to, there's no sort of element of foreseeability. What there is this phrase reasonably practicable. The analysis is basically, was there a thing that, if done, could have potentially mitigated or prevented this risk from realizing? And if there was there a thing that you could have done practicably that, could you have practically done that thing, And if that's the case, if that's met, well then, yeah, you're in the gun. And the problem with that as a standard is that it's really, really susceptible. Like we talked in dealing with this Nido thing, we talked about hindsight. That standard is shocking when it comes to hindsight, because whenever you do have a tragedy, like obviously something hasn't gone right, or you wouldn't have the tragedy. And it becomes very easy to look at the situation and go, gee, if this had happened or that had happened or the next thing had happened, would this have still occurred or have been as bad if it did occur? And it's quite easy to go on that little expedition. And so I think it is really very susceptible to delivering legal outcomes that don't really vibe with our sort of moral intuitions. I guess that's sort of the overarching point I'd make about it. Shane, is there anything on that you'd want to add?
No, I think that was, I agree. That's my personal view as well. And I was having on a golf trip recently, a really animated discussion with a guy who's been in the police for a long time. Sitting at the bar pool after, hard days golf. I joke, life's tough. But we had a great group of us went away for a golf trip down to Hamilton of all places, and we're sitting around, and this guy is pretty animated and actually has some very intelligent views around the criminal justice system, and he spoke from quite a visceral perspective of having seen how many people in the system that have been charged are guilty, and so he was quite biased in favour of the police. Having said that, he thought himself the police was actually quite a corrupt and, there was plenty of scallywags, in other words, within the police. However, on the balance, it's still on the right side of it, and of course, incredibly necessary. And we got into some discussions around rule of law, and one of the things I said to him was, if we didn't have the system the way it was, and every supposed criminal wasn't entitled to legal representation and a fair trial, then would be at risk of being like countries that don't have the rule of law, and that is far worse than the situations, their sort of exigencies or the marginal decisions that become headlines because they seem so wrong from a popular point of view. Now, the analogy here, there is some real, I think, analogy to what we're talking about here, because the question really to me is it wrong for the prosecutors to apply the statute and bring charges if it's within the black letter of the law, solely because from a moral point of view or a perception point of view, it shouldn't happen? And the answer to that question, I believe, is no, of course not. The problem is that because it is a tragedy that, you know, is visceral and it's close to our hearts, and it's so what's the word? It's so explicit. People were going to. I had the same reaction as you when I saw the headline. I thought, oh, that is bureaucracy gone mad. What next? You know, this is just bullshit. I had a little bit of a look into it, not like any the degree it sounds like you have. But what you're saying now is when you actually think about it a bit more, I think cool heads need to prevail. And, you know, there's sanction and there's sanction. So often when someone is sanctioned, when they're within the black letter of the law, they are guilty as such under a statute. Often whoever's presiding over that decision will find a way of imposing a sanction, which, reading between the lines, is the best possible or the lightest possible or the most appropriate sanction in the circumstances. But if the judges don't apply the actual statute of the law, then there is no rule of law. It's just a bunch of arbitrary people going around, you know, proclaiming what should or shouldn't be, and then the whole system is a fallacy. So we can sit here, you know, all night, and we'll never reach agreement. You know, say with you know, groups of people from the way they settle. You know, I'd like to see what the victims have to say about it. What about the families of the people who are the heroes themselves? You could just debate it forever, couldn't you?
Well, I think that's very true. And, you know, one thing I'd say there is, you know, I think you did right that, like, if sort of certainty leads to this black letter draconianism, like there are equal risks or potentially bigger risks in uncertainty in the law. But it does seem to me a little, having looked at it a bit, you know, it's weird in a country where we have such a focus on adventure tourism that we don't have a better attempt to draw bespoke law around that particular thing. Because, you know, in most workplace situations, in most lines of life, we're trying to minimize risk, you know, as much as we possibly can, really, within sort of the bounds of economic practicality. But there's a class of recreation where risk is kind of the point, or at least the perception of risk, if not the reality of it. And, you know, I think that that's kind of what drives some of the public outrage, is that everybody implicitly kind of understands that, you know, walking around on an active volcano is a thing that might be able to go wrong. Like, you know, it's at least a little bit foreseeable that could have turned out poorly. And we all know that, you know, I'd probably have gone for a trip to White Island quite happily, and I would have said, hey, this could go really wrong for me, but the chance that it will is very, very low. And that's probably what a realistic appraisal of that risk is. You know, maybe the risk is higher than people think, and maybe there are people that, you know, have better data on that. And, you know, I don't know, but yeah, I think that there needs to be, it'd be good to have a framework specifically for that kind of activity, where there's more of an ability for individuals to assume risk, and for waivers to be signed. And because, of course, the health and safety legislation as it stands, there's a specific provision you can't contract out of it. It
It's
applies.
quite new. Is it about 15 or 16? It's quite new.
15. It was brought in because of the Pike River thing.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just an evolving, evolving body of law or rules to meet what has actually happened historically. So no one gets, like you said, nothing's perfect, and maybe it does need to evolve because it's quite different. This situation we're talking about, to say paper pushers like you and me.
That's my view, is that I think it's been too reactionary, and it tries to be all things for all people. And I mean, honest to God, you see the kind of obligations that it imposes if you paid attention to them, if you're a lawyer or an accountant, where the workplace risk, it's like, what, you're going to get a paper cut? And, this is meant to be the same sort of regime that services the forestry industry or fisheries, And there is kind of like a regulatory layer under the Act that tries to make it a little bit more bespoke. But at least from what I could see looking at it, without admittedly being although I don't know that there really are that many people that could say they're a practitioner specifically and only of that kind of health and safety legislation. It tends to fall under employment. But I'm sure there are some people of that description, but and they might have a better view on that. But looking at it to the extent I have, it doesn't look like those sort of regulatory frameworks that sit under the main Act really modify the main principles of the Act that much on a vocation-to-vocation basis. Hey, just to maybe wrap that up with something that's a little bit more practical for people. One area there, like if you're a business owner and you've got to deal with health and safety as an element of what you do. One of the things that you obviously want to look at is having a policy or plan in place, or both, with respect to how you address it. And just a quick sort of practical rundown on that. Like, a lot of people are very worried about not having those documents. They're worried something happens, WorkSafe turns up. Oh my God, you didn't have a plan. Oh my God, you didn't have a policy. How terrible. And that's a real risk. But what people are less aware of is that there's also a real risk in having one. It's still better to have one. So I'd, to be more specific, there's a real risk in having the wrong sort of plan or policy. Because if you go to a lawyer and they don't know the space well and they draft a really gold-plated plan and policy that just says, you're going to do everything under the sun to reduce and avoid all possible risks in your business. And that practically, very few of these things are actually going to get done because they're not really feasible in the day-to-day running of your business.
Sounds like an AML compliant risk management program.
Is it sort of similar in that area, is it, Shane?
We paid these chumps a lot of money to do ours, and they had the temerity to, first of all, they put another law firm's name in, so they clearly just decided we were of similar, characteristics. Not only, I won't say the guy's name because I'm not into being nasty and like publicly naming and shaming people, although I've got a bit harder. I wouldn't have paid them the rest of what we owed them now if this happened today. But they not only did they do that, we sent it back. They sent it again with just wrong again. I was like, fucking unbelievable. In the end, he's like, oh, I professionally reviewed it, but that was just bullshit. It was just like, but yeah, it's exactly like that, like boilerplated. And it kind of was so well done that it really wasn't well done, if that makes sense. It was so kind of perfect and non-tailored to, and, in our recent audit, which was fine in terms of identifying the risk, and we're a very small commercial firm, so it's quite easy. I'm obviously intimately involved with, I will get to know everyone coming through the door and everything will be done. That was all fine. But at the same time, it's like you have this program that you pay decent chunk of, pony up a decent chunk of change for, and you're in the situation where this, like you called it, gold-plated sort of parameters around it bear no real resemblance to the actual risk in your business, or it can't be practically applied day to day, so that you could even argue it's worse than not even having one.
It's at least as bad, because if workplace turns up, and they look and they go, okay, do you have a health and safety policy? Where's your plan? And they get it, and they see all these things that you've said you're going to do, and then they find that none of these things were done. Well, they've got, okay, so you knew these risks existed. You knew there were things you could do to, reasonably and practicably mitigate them. Clearly, you thought they were practicable because you had them in your plan, and yet you didn't do them. And at that point, you're just stuffed. Like, you've got, it's...
Yeah, but the more I think about it as we're talking, I mean, surely, if you, like you said, if you're walking on a volcano, there almost really should be a completely different act for that sort of thing. For anything above the level of risk, or anything sort of so outside of the normal realm of the normal workplace.
I'd like to see it more bespoke. I think that there are some things that are inherently low probability catastrophic events, and it's desirable that people have the ability to, go out and take those sort of risks. But the kind of current law doesn't really kind of gel with that. It's not, it sort of fits uncomfortably with it. I think that's right.
Interesting.
On that point of the plan thing, I'll just, one thing to top that off. I did once have a job.
Impressive.
I had a job at one point where I had to draft from scratch a health and safety policy for a quasi-government agency, and a reasonably sizable thing, and something in a space where there was quite a lot of risk. And the policy that I drafted was a very, very careful restatement of exactly what's in the Act. As in, it was written to look meaningful, but all it really did is say, we acknowledge the risks and responsibilities, and we acknowledge that we have to do the things that we have to do under the Act, and that we will take steps to do them. And it was just real sophistry. So, if that's any guide. But I think, for people who do have to deal with this stuff, a key thing would be having an advisor who understands your industry and knows what the industry standards are, because that's a pretty good litmus test for the court. Like, if you're doing more or less what everybody else is doing, then, like, that gives a reasonable level of comfort at least.
You just don't want to be at the bottom of the pile, right? That's what we say.
That's right.
We don't, we're not in this for gold stars, but you just don't want to be a prick at the bottom of the pile that they make an example of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to characterize it.
All right, mate. Well, let's wrap this up. Only a few more weeks now to the end of the year. Thank you, everybody that's tuned in this evening. It was probably a little bit, Mike and I are probably a little bit underpowered, not our usual charismatic and witty selves tonight. I'm joking, by the way. It's pretty
part of the year, though. Yeah,
started badly and it's getting worse. But no, we're really we really enjoy coming on here, and we get a good little following of sort of 400 or 500 downloads, so to speak, a week, which is pretty cool to think there's 400 or 500 people out there clicking on our little video. And I bump into someone at the pools the other day going for a swim and said, I enjoy your videos, and saw an agent I haven't seen for ages. Just had a had their first child with his wife. He said, I watch your videos. Actually, he didn't say, if he's watching now, he didn't say he enjoyed them. He says he's seen them. So maybe there's a distinction there. No, people do watch them, and it seems like people get stuff out of them, and we definitely get clients out of them, and as you will too, Mike. And you're coming up to Auckland this year, and if you guys want a good litigator, I've had Mike do some stuff for us, and he's a gun, and a lovely guy to deal with. So look, I think it's really fun, really beneficial, and it's certainly not just constrained to lawyers and boring discussions about law, but anyone out there that has a business and has some even mildly competent or oratorical, is that even a word, skills, should get out there and do this stuff. Put yourself out there. Don't be scared to be laughed at or poked fun at. We've never had anyone poke fun at us. That's probably gonna,
at least not to our face.
Oh yeah, well you've had that your whole life behind you. There's a good saying, Mike. What other people say about me is none of my business. Get out there and do it, and it's certainly been good to us, and we've really enjoyed it, and we look forward to evolving it next year when we're building a little studio at our premises in Hobson Street, where Mike's going to be joining us hopefully on a weekly basis, and continuing to put ourselves out there. So thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next week. Cheers, Mikey.
Thanks, Shane.
See you, mate.